The world of global trade was just turned on its head. President Donald Trump has locked in a historic $1.3 trillion deal with the European Union, a move that redraws the economic map. But as the U.S. and EU celebrated their new arrangement, America's closest ally was left standing in the cold. Canada got nothing. This isn't just a missed opportunity. It's a fundamental break from decades of North American trade unity under NAFTA and USMCA. Trump went it alone, securing $750 billion in U.S. energy exports and $600 billion in EU investment. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mark Carney's government wasn't at the table. How did this happen, and what does this historic split mean for Canada's future? To really understand what's happening, you have to look past the headlines and dig into the details. This U.S. EU pact isn't your typical free trade agreement. Think of it more as a high-stakes political handshake with a lot of fine print and some serious strings attached. It's a framework of managed trade, designed to de-escalate a trade war that was threatening to boil over and plunge the global economy into a recession. The deal was struck just days before an August 1st deadline, when Trump threatened to slam Europe with catastrophic 30% tariffs. At its core, the deal is built on two massive commitments designed to slash the U.S. trade deficit with the EU. The centerpiece of the new economic strategy is a $52 billion push for U.S. semiconductor dominance. Through the CHIPS Act, Washington is funneling billions into building advanced semiconductor fabrication plants, or fabs, on American soil. On the surface, it's a strategic masterstroke, a direct response to supply chain vulnerabilities exposed in recent years and a clear move to counter China's tech ambitions. The goal is to bring the manufacturing of the world's most critical technology back home, securing a vital national and economic interest. However, the reality on the ground presents a more complicated picture. The first major hurdle is the intense talent shortage. Industry leaders quietly admit that the U.S. currently lacks the tens of thousands of specialized engineers and technicians needed to run these cutting-edge facilities. It's one thing to fund a factory. It's another entirely to find the workforce to operate at 24/7. This isn't a problem solved with a checkbook, but one that requires a decade of educational and vocational pipeline development. Furthermore, there's the issue of global market dynamics. While the U.S. builds its capacity, established players in Taiwan and South Korea aren't standing still. They are accelerating their own technological roadmaps. The risk is that by the time these multi-billion-dollar U.S. fabs come online in the late 2020s, the leading edge of technology may have already moved on, leaving these new facilities a half step behind from day one. Now for the part that affects nearly everything else, the new tariff reality. The era of ultra-low tariffs between these two giants is over. The U.S. will now impose a 15% tariff on the vast majority of goods coming from the EU. This includes critical European exports like cars, auto parts, and pharmaceuticals. For the EU, accepting this was a bitter pill to swallow. Before 2025, the average U.S. tariff on its goods was just 1.2%. But the alternative was Trump's threat of a 30% tariff, a move that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said would have brought trade to a halt and put millions of jobs at risk. She called the 15% rate the best we could do because it offered stability and predictability. However, there are important exceptions. The deal includes a zero-for-zero arrangement for certain strategic goods. Products like aircraft, certain chemicals, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment will have no tariffs, protecting deeply integrated global supply chains. But it's unbelievable to think that even within this deal, some of the most painful tariffs remain. The brutal 50% U.S. tariffs on European steel and aluminum are still in place. The White House has made it clear these will not change, signaling that U.S. protectionism is here to stay. This framework establishes a new normal where the U.S. uses high tariffs to shield industries it deems vital to national security. This whole situation, the EU getting a deal and Canada getting left out, didn't happen by accident. In fact, it all comes down to a head-on collision between two radically different ways of thinking. On one side of the coin, you have President Trump's trade strategy, guided by one clear principle: America first. This view treats global trade as a zero-sum game. Multilateral agreements like the WTO are seen as restrictive. Instead, the U.S. prefers aggressive one-on-one negotiations where it can use the massive power of its market as a weapon. The playbook has become predictable. The administration targets a country with a large trade surplus, threatens devastating tariffs with a hard deadline, and forces that country to the table. To avoid the worst-case scenario, the trading partner must agree to a new, higher baseline tariff and offer massive concessions, or buy-downs, like the EU's energy and investment promises. This strategy has been rolled out across the globe. Before the EU deal, Japan, the United Kingdom, Vietnam, and others all agreed to similar frameworks, accepting new tariffs in exchange for market access. The EU deal is simply the largest and most significant application of this doctrine to date. On the other side, you have Prime Minister Mark Carney's government in Canada playing a completely different game. Facing an unpredictable US, Canada has adopted a strategy of sovereign reconstruction. The core idea is that Canada can no longer assume the US will be a reliable partner, and must therefore build up its own economic strength and independence. Internally, the flagship policy is the One Canadian Economy Act, designed to break down trade barriers between Canadian provinces to create a more unified and resilient domestic market. It also aims to fast-track major infrastructure projects to better move Canadian resources from coast to coast. Externally, the strategy is all about trade diversification. Over 75% of Canada's exports go to the US, a massive economic dependency. To reduce this risk, Carney's government is aggressively pursuing deeper ties with other markets through trade deals like CETA with Europe and the CPTPP with Asia-Pacific nations. A $5 billion trade diversification corridor fund has been created to build the ports and rail lines needed to connect Canadian businesses with new overseas customers. This long-term structural approach defines Canada's negotiating stance with the US. Carney has repeatedly said he will only sign a deal that's a good deal for Canada and won't be rushed by Trump's deadlines. The goal isn't to get a deal at any cost, it's to protect Canada's economic sovereignty for the long haul. So, you have these two completely different game plans. When they clashed, it was almost inevitable that someone would be left out. The big question is, why was it Canada? The truth is, Canada's exclusion was practically baked into the cake from the start. For decades, North America traded as a bloc. Under NAFTA and USMCA, the partners coordinated, but Trump's divide-and-conquer approach shattered that model. By negotiating with every country individually, the US maximizes its leverage. Sidestepping Canada and Mexico to deal directly with the EU was a clear signal that the USMCA is no longer a platform for joint action, but just another bilateral relationship to be managed on US terms. This exposed a painful paradox for Canada. It's strange to think about, but its greatest economic strength, its deep integration with the US economy, became its biggest negotiating weakness. The EU was able to offer a massive, shiny new prize, the $750 billion energy purchase. This was the perfect buy-down for Trump's transactional demands. Canada simply couldn't make a similar offer. Why? Because it's already one of America's largest and most secure energy suppliers. About 94% of Canada's crude oil exports already flow south through a web of integrated pipelines. You can't offer something as a new concession when it's already a core part of the existing relationship. This paradox extends to other sectors like auto manufacturing, where supply chains are so intertwined that tariffs on Canadian goods are also a tax on US producers. This reality left Canada at the negotiating table without the kind of big, clean, headline-grabbing concession the White House was looking for. Faced with this, the Carney government stood firm, refusing to be bullied into a bad deal. From the US perspective, this looked like stubbornness. President Trump publicly commented that he has not really had a lot of luck with Canada, and that his northern neighbor may just pay tariffs. The talks stalled because one side wanted a quick transactional win, and the other was focused on a long-term structural defense. Look, this isn't just some high-level political chess match. This has real, tangible consequences hitting the ground right now in Canada, and many of the numbers are grim. Major economic analysis is showing that Canadian industries hit with the highest US tariffs are lagging far behind the rest of the economy. The manufacturing sector contracted in the first half of 2025. The auto sector has been hammered, with exports plummeting to 2022 levels under the weight of 25% tariffs. Steel and aluminum producers are also struggling under 50% duties. And when you look at it province by province, the picture gets even clearer. Projections show the economic hit will be hardest in manufacturing-heavy Ontario and resource-dependent provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, which could see their GDP shrink by 1.4%. The escalating trade conflict has cast a pall of uncertainty over the Canadian economy, with economists now flagging the growing risk of a shallow technical recession. The most immediate casualty is business investment, which has been effectively frozen as corporations pause capital expenditures and adopt a wait-and-see approach. In essence, Canada's economic trajectory has become hostage to a dispute it has a little direct leverage to resolve. This pressure is forcing a strategic recalculation in Ottawa. In response, Carney's government is accelerating a pivot toward deeper economic ties with the EU and Asia, seeking to build a counterweight to the instability in Washington. This long-term diversification, however, does little to address the short-term reality: Canada's shrinking influence. It's being relegated to a spectator role as the U.S. and EU forge a new transatlantic trade framework, reportedly establishing a 15% tariff as the de facto price of market access. The once celebrated special relationship has been supplanted by a more guarded and transactional rivalry. Canada chose principles over a deal, and now it's on the outside looking in. A principled defense of sovereignty or a catastrophic miscalculation? Prime Minister Carney's government stood firm against Washington's high-pressure tactics, but that refusal cost Canada its seat at the table, leaving it isolated as the US and EU redraw the economic map. Was Carney right to hold the line, or did Canada just miss the deal of the decade? Tell us what you think in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more analysis.